evening, everyone. A bond hearing today in the murder case against a wealthy Connecticut man whose attorney says he tried to commit suicide yesterday right before a scheduled court appearance. Missing mother Jennifer Doulos disappeared on May 24th last year. Her estranged husband, Fotis Dulos, is charged with killing her. He's clinging to life. Fotis Dulos' friend and former attorney and Fotis Dulos' former girlfriend are accused of conspiring in the alleged murder. A judge ruled that the hearing, which was disrupted by yesterday's apparent suicide, would continue without Fotis Dulos present. Today, the judge ordered Doulos be arrested again and added $500,000 on top of the current $6 million bond. Doulos remains, however, in critical condition in a Bronx hospital, though, so he'll remain there undergoing treatment for now before that arrest order kicks in.
See Mr. Doulos, and his medical condition is dire. The negotiated agreement we're reaching will make it possible his family's having access to him in the days to come. In the event that he recovers, we will waive extradition and are putting that on the record right now. I've met with the hospital administration and they're aware of his situation. He's also on the functional equivalent of the psychiatric hold, so if he were spontaneously to recover at this moment and asked to leave, he would not be free to leave.
The state said that if Doulos does leave, defense attorney Norm Pattis will be allowed to move with him. 3 attorneys are along with us tonight. David Ring is in California. Mike Korabanek practices in New Jersey. Let's begin with Ashley McMahon in Georgia. So, Ashley, attorney Norm Pattis, in an interview late last night with NBC, railed on Doulos' critics, complained about the savageness of the criminal justice system, and said all the folks who harped on Mr. Doulos can obviously take grim satisfaction in the suicide attempt. So the question I have is, has the presumption of innocence been lost in society?
Aaron, I think it's been gone for longer than we have even realized. You know, with everyone having access to so much information nowadays and everybody pretty much champing at the bit in order to give their opinion when not all the facts are out. We know that these cases take a long time for the prosecution to get their case together. Even once they have an indictment, they still have work to do. And same for the defense. You're starting to build your defense and get all the information together. And very uninformed people, you know, make comments off the cuff all over, and people have an idea of whether or not they think someone is guilty before they ever even step foot into that courtroom. So I think it's been gone, and it's an ideal that we're trying to get back to.
Attorney David Ring. Norm Pattis, the defense attorney for Fotis Dulos, said he felt responsibility for, in his words, not being Doulos' good shepherd through the valley of the shadow of death. Is that understandable in a moment like this?
You know, I think it is. I mean, look, every attorney, no matter how the horrible things your client might be accused of, a criminal defense attorney is trying to shepherd and guide that person through the criminal justice system. And this particular client tried to kill himself. I mean, that's a heavy weight for the lawyer to bear. And he's thinking, did I do something wrong? Did I not give him the right information? Should I have held his hand a little bit more? So sure, that's an understandable statement from the lawyer.
Mike Korabanek, did society pressure Fotis Dulos to do this? I'm sure the prosecutor would potentially argue, if it comes to that this wasn't society, this was guilt.
I tend to agree with you. I don't think that the attorney should be blaming society for what happened. I think the prosecution is going to, at some point in time, make this a very big push to use a consciousness of guilt, the act of the attempt of suicide.
And that's even if we get to a proceeding in this. I keyed in on Norm Pattis' words, saying that's if there's a recovery here. He didn't use that exact word, but he said this was very, very grim. We'll follow the story. The fiance of Aaron Hernandez and one of his defense attorneys are together speaking out about claims in a new documentary. Shayana Jenkins Hernandez and Jose Baez spoke to ABC News about the late football player. Hernandez committed suicide behind bars after he was convicted in one killing, but acquitted in the killings of 2 others. The attorney and the fiance addressed claims in the film about Hernandez's sexuality.
You can't describe someone's sexuality without them being here. Although I've had a child with Aaron, I still can't tell you how he was feeling inside. No one can. I wish that he would have told me, because I would not have loved him any differently.
His health was a huge factor. I mean, I don't understand why we need to search around for an answer as to why he committed suicide when he was at an advanced stage of a disease where the primary symptom is suicide.
Let's move now to testimony from another so-called other bad acts witness in the trial of movie producer Harvey Weinstein today. My colleague Jesse Weber has been inside the courtroom for us where cameras are not allowed.
Today we heard the testimony from Dawn Dunning, one of the 3 Molyneux witnesses that the state has called to show that Harvey Weinstein has a pattern, a common scheme or plan with these women. Dunning was an aspiring actress and dancer who worked as a cocktail waitress at a club called PM back in 2004 and 2005. She had said that she had met Weinstein at the club and they developed an 8-month working relationship. According to Dunning, he invited her to the Mercer Hotel in Soho. It was a suite that he actually turned into a production office for one of his films. When she arrives, Weinstein directs her to the adjoining bedroom, where he proceeds to take up her skirt and sexually assault her. A few weeks later, Dunning claims that she was invited to another meeting at a restaurant in the Intercontinental Hotel, but when she arrives, she meets Weinstein's assistant, Bonnie. Bonnie indicates that Weinstein is actually upstairs in his room. According to Dunning, when they get up there, Harvey Weinstein opens the door, but he's only in a bathrobe. It's then he propositions Dunning into a threesome with him and his assistant. He begins to scream loudly, saying such things as, "This is how the industry works," implying that actresses such as Charlize Theron and Salma Hayek had done this in the past. She runs out, gets a cab, and goes home. During her testimony, she was highly emotional and crying at some pivotal points. But then we moved on to the cross-examination by Arthur Aidala. He hit on the fact that Dunning had done a numerous amount of media appearances and had spoken to the district attorney's office on multiple occasions, but had only discussed the Intercontinental encounter. He also hit upon the fact that unlike several of the other accusers, he didn't use any kind of physical force against Dunning. She was free to come and go into that suite, and that's exactly what she did. He concluded his cross-examination by asking Dunning about her hiring a plaintiff's attorney. Remember, the big issue here, pointed out by his defense, is that these women have come forward to extort Harvey Weinstein, or they have something to gain against him by coming forward. This is Jesse Weber reporting for Law&Crime.
Let's begin our analysis of this case with attorney David Ring. He joins me separately now because he represents one of Weinstein's accusers. So, David, the judge is allowing additional witnesses in for the state because of the defense attacks on the accusers. You're a likely beneficiary of that tactic. In your opinion, how huge of a mistake is the defense making here with these full throttle attacks on these women?
Well, hey, listen. Okay, I mean, I am 100% on the victim's side, but what do you expect the defense to do? I mean, anyone who thought that these defense attorneys were going to come into this trial and soft pedal it or play it easy or be polite and nice were kidding themselves. That's just naivety. They're coming in here for blood, and now we're seeing it. And this is not surprising to me. This is how victims get attacked in the courtroom.
And we've heard attacks from the court of public opinion that this is just too combative, that this is not appropriate. But we have constitutional standards of confrontation at play here, which, as an attorney myself, I'm pledged to uphold as well. So we have that playing into the mix.
I think you've heard, this is an old saying, you know, the greatest tool to get to the truth is cross-examination. Trials without cross-examination are worthless. And listen, I take offense to how these defense lawyers are doing it, and a lot of people do. But they're doing their job, and they're doing it incredibly aggressively. It might completely blow up in their face. It might backfire big time. But that's the tactic they've chosen, and they're going all in.
Boy, that line, "This is how the industry works," said to have been uttered during an attack. That's what was ringing in my ears after Jesse's report.
Well, I'll tell you what, that's how the industry worked for Harvey Weinstein. You know, he's the guy who he had so much power, so much influence, so much control over the entire industry. He thought he could get away with anything, and he did for many years. I said it before, this is the guy who could end careers with a phone call or an email. And that's such a unique situation. And I think the prosecution's done a great job showing the jury how powerful he was and how these women just succumbed to that power. Like they had no choice. They just wilted in front of him.
Attorney David Ring representing one of Weinstein's accusers. Great analysis on the case tonight. Sentencing today for an Arizona defendant convicted of shooting a trooper in the face. Trooper James Casey became known nationally on the hit A&E show Live PD. He testified that through the process of elimination, he was sure defendant Ramon Bueno was the one who pulled the trigger. A jury convicted Bueno of aggravated assault and related charges, but was hung as to attempted murder. The judge delivered a 119 3/4 year sentence after these statements.
Originally, I was going to ask you to sentence him to, I know numerically it's not possible, to 155 years in prison, one for each stitch that I received in my mouth. I would like you, if possible, to run all these sentences consecutive as long as possible, so he will never see the light of day. He is a very dangerous man. Had he just kept still that night, we wouldn't be here.
I say that I am sorry for what happened to James Casey. And regardless of what they continue to say about me, that he always been in my prayers. But I also like to ask James Casey, as well as Ellen Dahl, if they can look up in the Lord's book and look up Exodus chapter 20, verse 16. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, that is the line of the Christian Bible which says, "You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor." He's basically accusing the victim of lying on the stand. Here's how the judge addressed the defendant after that remark.
Mr. Bueno, you haven't had an easy life. You've made some choices that have resulted in you being here today. I can't even fathom what resulted in those choices. I don't know who you were before you got here before me. We've been the judge and defendant for 3 years, and you have been nothing but respectful to me. So what that says to me is that you have the capacity and that you have made choices that have resulted in grave harm to many, many people. But what I'm sentencing you for today is the harm that you caused to the people in this case, keeping in mind the history that brought us here. This is not an action that occurred in a vacuum. This is an action that occurred after a lifetime of other crimes. And those crimes suggest to me that you are a danger to society.
And still ahead tonight, closing arguments in the triple murder of a Florida family. A jury is deciding whether this defendant killed his mother and brothers for money. The state tries to dismiss defense doubts in a case tied to the Wicca religion. That's after the break. Closing arguments in the Florida trial of a man accused of killing his mother and his brothers because he wanted money. Defendant Donald Hartung cut off his mother's pinky finger, prosecutors say, to torture her into giving him the combination to her safe. He also killed his other brothers, the state says, in a case with ties to the Wicca religion. Investigators described a bloody crime scene here at the home where the victims were stabbed, beaten, and shot. Authorities say the defendant went here for dinner, and a neighbor saw him leaving much later than usual the night the state thinks the killings occurred. Here's how the state broke down the timeline.
He arrived at the house a little bit earlier than normal. Hartung cooked. We know John and Bonnie ate because you know the stomach contents during the course of their autopsy. Purefoy told you that this defendant removed the D-Link cameras that Richard had set up to watch his mom because she had fallen. This defendant killed John first in the den, beat him in the head with a hammer, slit his throat. You heard from Marlon Purefoy that this defendant told him that he tortured his mother by cutting her pinky in order to get safe combinations. How could Marlon Purefoy know that? The medical examiner didn't know that. Hartung killed Bonnie in the family room, in the living room where she normally sat, beat her in the head with a hammer, slit her throat. Defendant goes through Bonnie's purse, gets the safe combinations. You heard testimony from Purefoy that this defendant may have gotten some money out of a safe. Richard leaves work 6:36. We know Richard arrives home from the neighbor's testimony, and at that point, this defendant ambushes Richard. He shoots Richard as soon as Richard walks in that den. Richard struggles. This defendant slits Richard's throat. This defendant grabbed Richard's belt to flip him over. This defendant stole Richard's keys and his wallet. Then the defendant covers Richard's body. Not as much covering as the others. Bonnie has 19 bags of stuff on top of her. John has 4. Richard has 2. Goes through Richard's belongings, the black case, the checkbook. And then this defendant left.
The state also presented visual evidence of money they say the defendant took from the victims.
This defendant was the black sheep. He was the outcast. He did not even have a key to the family's home. This defendant was excluded from his own mother's will. It was them, Bonnie, Richard, and John, against him. And then, when their heads were beat in and their throats were slashed, it was him against them. The Smith family was very unassuming. You would never know just by looking at them or what they drove or looking at their house, especially inside, that they had money. But they did. You've got the account of John showing $213,000. The accounts of Mom showing $332,000. The accounts of Richard showing $349,000 for a total of almost $900,000. And this defendant knew about it. Because remember, he told his coworker, Mr. Bailey, that his mom was wealthy, and when she died, he was going to get the money, quit his job, and retire. And lo and behold, ladies and gentlemen, 3 weeks later, this defendant submitted his letter of resignation. This defendant, and this defendant alone, had the motive to murder his 3 family members.
Hartung's defense accused the state of refusing to listen to the defendant's many pleas that he is innocent.
There's a lot of fact that Ms. Jensen gave you. There's a lot of fantasy. There's a lot of fantasy in what she said. She wants you to assume things that are not in evidence. Your verdict is from the evidence, not a flight of fantasy that you may hear from this podium right here. Repeatedly, Mr. Hartung told Deputy Infinger, I didn't do it. Hartung, after waiving his rights to talk with the investigators, also voluntarily agreed to a DNA test, which was the buccal swab being taken. He also was offered a lie detector test, which he agreed to. This was an all-hands-on-deck situation. 3 murdered bodies discovered that day. In addition to the bodies, they called out all of the homicide investigators to investigate this case. And they're saying they can't find a polygraph examiner. I'll suggest to you they didn't want one.
The defense insists the killings have nothing to do with the Wicca religion in this attempt to distance Hartung from the murders.
We put on Dr. Larson to explain to you, and I hope he did a good job of what the Wicca religion is and the fact that that Wiccans do not murder people. The blue moon doesn't have any greater significance than any other full moon. And the fact that the bodies were not put in any ceremonial fashion. There is nothing in the Wicca religion that has to do with sacrifices of animals, sacrifices of people. That is absolutely ridiculous.
A series of controversial witnesses have taken the stand in this case. First, the jailhouse informant you heard the prosecutor talk about, Marlon Purifoy, testified other inmates thought Hartung was a witch. He says the defendant talked with him about the murders after a conversation about Wicca. Purifoy himself was sentenced to 30 years in prison for beating his own girlfriend with a hammer. The medical examiner who testified about the wounds the victim suffered quit her job after accusations that her work documentation was inadequate and other serious questions about how much money she was making working for 4 counties at once in northwestern Florida. A state commission refused to reappoint her last summer and she resigned. The former crime scene tech who testified first for the state and then for the defense is serving 10 years probation. She pleaded guilty to stealing drugs, including prescriptions, from a law enforcement evidence room. And the pathologist who testified for the defense resigned from his job in the District of Columbia after accusations of scandal. The Washington Post reported in 2003 that Dr. Jonathan Arden, quote, created a climate of sexual harassment so pervasive that several deputies were reduced to tears. Arden denied those accusations and said they were the result of disgruntled employees who refused to help him reform a dysfunctional organization. So let's jump in with some analysis on this one. Ashley McMahon, we've got all these witnesses stacking up with potential credibility issues here, and the jury's still at it deliberating as we speak.
I mean, talk about problematic. It's like everybody who touched this case in one way or another has either resigned or had some major scandal happen, or even be arrested in the case of the crime scene tech. So I think we're gonna be waiting a minute for this jury, but I'm intrigued to see what they're gonna say.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us are. David, no quick verdict here. You know, the defense tried to get that forensic pathologist up to say, hey, the murder's going to happen at any point the day after the state thinks, maybe even 2 days after the state thinks they happened, because the bodies were discovered several days later. And the prosecutor put a great calendar up on the screen, basically trying to refute the way the defense posited that whole theory. I thought the closing arguments from the state were very effective. They used great demonstrative tools. What did you see? What did you make of it?
Well, look, both of these lawyers are obviously incredibly competent, very comfortable in the courtroom. Prosecutor did a great job weaving the actual evidence in with her argument and just laying it out for this jury to go, yep, everything she's saying is backed up by the evidence. And the defense attorney did a great job of raising reasonable doubt. It's going to be a very interesting outcome.
I thought so as well. Mike Korobanix, your thoughts on this when you've been watching this with us?
Well, it seems like this is the witness list is equivalent to the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Land of Broken Toys. Everybody's coming with such baggage. I think, though, as David said, these attorneys are both very skilled. And the prosecutor basically was weaving a web. And while they don't have a smoking gun, there's enough circumstances in that web has been built. The defense, on the other hand, said there may be a web, but it's really not a web that's strong. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, you know, my opinion is the state may have eked out a win here. That's just my sense. We'll wait and see. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. Thanks a lot to the panelists tonight. We'll be back tomorrow at 5 o'clock with our recap of the day in court right here on The Debrief.